Good evening, everyone, and welcome to tonight's very exciting Free Library of Philadelphia Foundation author event. It is wonderful to see you all here. As I have often said, the author event series is one of this city's great cultural treasures. By bringing authors together with readers, we create a space for engaging conversations, for exciting conversations, and we make the literary world accessible to the Philadelphia community. There is still much more to come in our spring season. From now through early June, we'll welcome to this stage poets, novelists, physicians, political commentators, a United States senator, and much more. So I do hope that you'll join us. And you can register for these events on our webpage at freelibraryfoundation.org. I also want to say just a few quick words about our organization in general. The Foundation works together with the Free Library to support programming and advance its mission of promoting literacy throughout the Philadelphia region. But as a nonprofit, we are, of course, reliant upon your support to achieve these goals, so please do consider donating, which you can also do through our website. Again, that's freelibraryfoundation.org. Before we get to tonight's program, there are a few people and organizations I would like to thank. We are grateful first and foremost to this season's sponsor, Comcast, whose support allows us to keep these events as accessible and as affordable as possible. I would also like to thank Uncle Bobby's, our partner bookseller, and the Philadelphia Citizen, our new media partner. Tonight, we welcome Rebecca Romney, who is a rare book dealer and the co-founder of Type Punch Matrix, a rare book company based in Washington, D.C. Rebecca is the author of Printer's Error, Irreverent Stories from Book History and the Romance Novel in English, a survey in rare books 1769 to 1999. Since 2011, she has appeared as the rare book specialist on the History Channel's show Pawn Stars, a great show, I'm sure some would agree. She was also featured in the 2019 documentary The Booksellers. Tonight, she'll be speaking with us about her brilliant new book, Jane Austen's Bookshelf, which chronicles her efforts to build a book collection of Austen's favorite women writers. It's a terrific book. If you haven't had the opportunity to read it yet, I truly recommend it. Rebecca will be joined in conversation by Allie Alvis, who is curator of special collections of the Winterthur Library, where they are responsible for the stewardship and engagement of the collection. They have previously worked as an antiquarian bookseller at Type Punch Matrix and as the Special Collections Reference Librarian for the Smithsonian Libraries and Archives. Allie's research is diverse and far-reaching, with interests in physical patterns of use in books, the history of ephemera, and arts and crafts bookbindings. They are particularly involved in the study and act of using social media for communicating book history and maintain popular accounts across various platforms as book historia. Anyone who knows me knows that I have been looking forward to this one, and I hope you are as excited as I am. Please join me in welcoming Rebecca Romney and Allie Alvis.
Hello.
Hello. Well, we already said hello. Hello.
Yes, hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming out and being inside on this beautiful evening. Yeah.
Should we get started?
Yeah, and thank you to Rebecca for coming here and being inside also on this beautiful evening instead of partying it up in Philly.
Well, that's tempting too. It was a nice walk here, though.
All right. Well, just to kick things off, tell me a little bit about how this project got started. What was the bee in your bonnet that kind of got you to say, well, now I have to write about this?
This happened entirely by accident, and it was what book collectors often refer to as serendipity, which is the right book coming into my hands at the right time to set me down a rabbit hole. I am a rare book dealer, as mentioned in my bio, and I was on a house call, which for a rare book dealer means I'm going and I'm looking at a library for potential acquisition of either individual books or the entire library to buy. And there was a shelf of these gorgeous books that were published in the late 1880s, 1890s, early 1900s. They had this dark emerald green cloth and these elaborate gilt stamp designs on them, very Art Nouveau. And I looked at the shelf. I didn't even need to look at the texts. I said, I just want all of those. We're taking those. And so what that means is that the book that started this book was something I bought for its cover, not for its text. So the book was in that shelf, and it was a book called Evelina by Frances Burney. This was the 1903 edition illustrated by Hugh Thompson. And I had heard of Frances Burney before because she's mentioned in certain famous book collecting books and things, but I didn't know that much about her. So when I brought the book back to the shop and was cataloging it, I just did an initial kind of poking around. And I learned very quickly that she was one of Jane Austen's favorite authors, and that Austen almost certainly took the phrase Pride and Prejudice from Burney's second novel, Cecilia. And I am a big Jane Austen fan. I have read and reread her 6 completed novels. Like, that has been, a stable home for me for many years. And I had not known this. And that particularly stung because I'm a professional bookseller. And so I had this moment where it was a combination of ego blow and also tell me more. So I kind of I started down this rabbit hole, and I was reading more about Austen's reading habits. And I quickly learned that she had read people like Samuel Johnson and Samuel Richardson and Milton and Shakespeare and all of that. And she'd also read Frances Burney and Charlotte Lennox and Maria Edgeworth and Elizabeth Inchbald. And I realized I had read every single one of the men, and I had read not a single one of the women. And I thought, how did that happen? How could it be that stark? Literally all or none. And so I had this moment, I said, I need to do a correction in my own reading. And that led to the reading part of this book. This book is both a sort of reader memoir and a little bit of a book collecting, because the reading part was me saying, okay, well, I need to read these authors. And I initially had this reaction of, well, we don't really read Frances Burney that much anymore. I didn't think much of Evelina, so I'm going to read it out of curiosity because Austen liked it, but it's not going to be that good. And then I read it, and it was great. And that led to another shocking moment where I said, well, if it's great, then why do we not call it great anymore? Why is she not canonical, part of the canon? And that was my new question. If the question is, are these any good, yes or no? Yes, they're still good. The next question is, why don't we read them anymore? And that's where the book collecting came in, because what I did was I started buying editions of these books, editions of Evelina, for example, and noticing how commonly she was reprinted, say, in the 19th century, and how that starts to stop in the early 20th century. And I was tracing the history and print of her novels and of her diaries, and going through this long rise and fall of their reputations posthumously through book history, essentially. So those are the 2 strands that came together in this, was my own ignorance, and then the joy of taking advantage of the fact that I had found that spot, and here was a whole new project for me to get excited about.
Yeah, I really love, I've seen you call this book a bibliomemoir in other interviews, and I love that phrase. That's very much captures what this book is. As someone who reads a lot of sort of drier academic history books, no offense to historians in the audience, I have written my fair share of dry history things. It was very refreshing to read this book and see how much of you was in it, that it wasn't just a retelling of the stories of these women. When you started to write this, did you go in sort of with yourself in mind, or did you kind of start in one direction and realize, like, oh, I can't not talk about the process?
It was mostly intended from the beginning, but not as much as it became, I would say. So when I started it, I was very clear about my positioning, that I am not writing about this as an academic. A lot of what I'm doing in this book is it's building on the research that's already been done by academics. So the feminist recovery movement starting in the 1970s, there's a lot of me kind of fangirling about specific scholars, like Joyce Hemlow and Frances Burney, for example. We owe so much to her. And so I have these moments where I'm discovering their scholarship, and I am positioning myself very much as a layperson because I wanted to be clear in how I was structuring this book, that this is a type of project that anyone could do, that you don't have to have a PhD to do this. All you have to do is be maybe a little obsessive. Whatever topic that you're really interested in, you can explore it through book collecting. And you don't have to have a PhD, you just have to be excited and curious. And so I did build that in from the beginning, but then as I spent more and more time reading these books and having this reaction of, oh, these books feel really fresh and relevant to me. And that's such an important argument for why they should continue to be read. I mean, that's why we read these books that are hundreds of years old, right? Is that they still have something to say to us today. And so in order to make that argument, I had to say, what are these books saying to me personally? And that started getting woven in more. And so the book, I tried as much as possible to reveal the process, because for me, the process itself is the point.
Yeah, I like that a lot. And you see that, I think, reflected in the stories of a lot of these women who are writing not just for survival, but just because they can't not. And that's something that really shines through in a lot of these stories is this idea that, like, well, I have to, even if I've already burnt my other manuscripts, I can't stop.
Yeah, you could see I maybe appreciated that obsessiveness a little bit.
Kindred spirits. Speaking of a sort of joyfulness and personality in these kinds of books, you cite a few times the Smurfette principle, which is such a tremendous term. Could you talk about why, in this wide playing field of 18th and 19th century women writers, Jane Austen became the Smurfette?
Yeah, so I will define the Smurfette principle, which this was Katha Pollitt in the New York Times coined the term Smurfette principle, and it's essentially that you have one woman who just represents all women. And once you have that one Smurfette, you're good. You've accounted for women. That's done and done. And so the Smurfette principle. And so that's what happens with Austen, is Austen is called the first great woman writer in English. That's a major biography of her that came out in the 80s, describes her as that. And the fact of the matter is that when Austen was writing, she was not considered the greatest woman writer, not considered the greatest writer. In fact, the greatest writer at the time that she was attempting to get published, period, male or female, that was actually Maria Edgeworth. It was a woman. And her books were so much less popular, in fact, and less critically acclaimed than many of the contemporaries, the people who are in this book. And so what I realized over the course of writing this book and reading these authors was that Austen, too, she never saw herself as that, the first great woman writer in English, and she wasn't. If you actually go back and read these, you see that she is working within a rich ecosystem of artists in dialogue with one another. So even if you did read, say, Eveline, and you're like, that's not my thing, not my cup of tea, what you will see is how Austen's in dialogue with her. There's this scene in Pride and Prejudice that's very famous, right in the beginning, where they're at the ball, and Lizzie Bennet overhears Mr. Darcy say something kind of like terrible about her, and it leads to this initial tension in the plot, right? That's the whole enemies to lover. So Pride and Prejudice is a really core scene. If you have even seen, Pride and Prejudice movie, you know this scene. And if I had described that scene to a contemporary of Austen's, they would say, oh, you mean that scene in Evelina? Because that was the famous scene. There's one just like that at a ball where they overhear something terrible, the hero saying something terrible, and that leads to problems. So this idea that Austen can represent everyone else, it is stifling, because here I was, Austen has 6 completed novels. She died very young. She died at age 41. So I had been reading and rereading these and thinking, I just wish she had written more. I love her work. And I never took that extra step and said, Well, but I could read the books that she loved. There are other courtship novels that are just like what she was doing, that she was reacting to, that she was, borrowing tropes from, or she was in discussion with. I could read those. So I think what we often do with things like the canon, Austen's canonical, Burney's not, is we say, yes, Austen's canon, but Burney's not, so I'm not going to read her. And instead, it should be, yes, Austen's canon, and she liked Burney, so if I liked Austen, maybe I should read Burney.
Yeah, it shouldn't have been, but it was a real revelation for me about all the different flavors of things that these writers were writing. It wasn't just courtship novels. It wasn't, just Jane Austen and different sort of varieties of Jane Austen. Like, there were plays, there were gothics, there were parodies, and so much humor, and some really straight-laced advice books. And yeah, it was just wonderful to see that variety, and very shocking to realize, like, wow, that didn't even occur to me.
Right. I think that we still box people in history into, very simple categories, and we're inclined to do that with women as well, like women write novels. And in fact, a number of the women here, they're writing nonfiction, they're publishing their letters. They are, in fact, writing important works of British linguistic history, for example. That's one of the women in here. So there is a great variety because they were contributing across the board to print and literary culture at the time, but it so easily gets effaced into, well, the only one worth talking about is Austen.
Yeah, speaking of the variety, I flew through the chapter on Elizabeth Inchbald. I think she was my favorite. I loved her immovable determination to become an actress, like overcoming all of these obstacles, and she wanted it so bad, and she got it. She was successful, and it was just like, oh, this is fantastic. I love this story. And how you also wove in and brought this idea that her striving to be an actress really did play into her writing career, that it wasn't just like she was an actress and then she was an author at the end. It was, how she was able to bring that forward. But did you go into this project expecting to have a favorite author of the ones you selected, and did that change?
Oh, this is, choosing between children situation that you're doing to me. I can name particular books that I think were my favorite reads among everything. And then in terms of the people, I do love Elizabeth Inchbald. I have a engraved portrait of her. She's got this great portrait where she's got her hand on the book and she's looking directly at you, and it's just this, like, great stare. She's an actress, very piercing. But for me, I think the person I responded to most was this woman named Charlotte Lennox, because Charlotte Lennox has this kind of crazy story. So her father was in the military, and they moved around a lot when she was very young. They end up in colonial New York, and they feel like they can't financially support her, so they send her on a ship as a teenager, like at age 15 or something, back to London to be taken into the care of her aunt. And her aunt dies. And so she is essentially orphaned in London. But on the ship over, she has gotten a reputation for being incredibly precocious. She's able to write poetry that impresses everyone at her teenage genius. And so because she gets that reputation, she gets patronage from a lady at the court. And so Charlotte learns very quickly that this is the way that I can take care of myself, is through my intellect, through my wit. And so essentially, as soon as she is old enough, she starts publishing to support herself. And the thing that was so inspiring to me about her was not that. There are a number of women who are doing that. Elizabeth Inchbald's another example. But the fact that she really did need that money. When you're looking at 18th and early 19th century writers, and particularly women writers, you're often looking at women who have a lot of financial privilege. Austen herself is like this. Austen didn't need the money from the writing. She was taken care of financially by her father and then her brothers after her father passed. So any money that she got from her books was bonus for her. And that was the case of a number of the women in the book, but not for Charlotte Lennox. Charlotte Lennox needed to sell books. And the thing that was great was that she still made choices that were bold choices, even when she knew it might get her into trouble. She did this book called Shakespeare Illustrated, where she takes a bunch of sources that Shakespeare borrowed plot points from, and she translates those, they're often in French or Italian or whatever, and then she does this compare and contrast of the two. And then she criticizes Shakespeare. She actually says, I don't think Shakespeare did as well here as Ariosto. I think he mangled and defaced X, Y, and Z. She's very blunt. And the literary establishment essentially turned against her. And I just love that she was like, well, but that's how I feel, so that's what I'm going to publish, even if my whole economic life depends on it. She had to switch for a while into translation work after that because no one wanted her to print any criticism again. So I just found that that ability to stay true to oneself while also having to navigate commercial realities really relevant. As Allie knows, having a rare book business, I have to sell books in order to stay in business. And also as a rare book dealer, a huge part of what I do, as part of this ultimate goal that I share with collectors and curators, institutional rare book people, of preserving our collective cultural heritage. And so balancing values and commerce is very directly related to what I do. So I think that was partially why I felt so strongly to see someone like Lennox have a clear sense of who she was while also navigating real life.
Yeah, I remember I was cataloging something at Type Punch Matrix. It may have been a Charlotte Lennox. It may have been a Samuel Johnson something or other. And I remember you first telling me about Shakespeare Illustrated, and I was like, oh my gosh, like, I cannot believe this. This is fantastic. And then when I read this chapter, I was like, oh yeah. So that was a wonderful little callback for me.
There's some line, it's something like Shakespeare, talking about compared to the source, Shakespeare borrowed enough just to show his lack of originality and invented enough to show his want of judgment.
Welcome to the Shakespeare roast of the Free Library. Tonight's guest, Charlotte Lennox. Yes. Speaking of the good old rare book trade, I very much appreciate how you wove these tidbits about the trade into the book. It felt like there were so many different threads of your experience and Jane Austen and the experience of these women and literature. And then to see the rare book trade keep popping up, I was like, oh, I know that guy. And buying books throughout the chapters of this, building your collection, talking about how you're not just buying first editions that are six figures, that you're buying, the 1970 first reprint. And I just really liked how you compared and contrasted the different ways that you can get into collecting. And yeah, I would just like to hear a little bit more about how you defined the boundaries of your Jane Austen bookshelf.
Yeah, so I have a lot of opinions about collecting, as Allie knows. I did co-found and administer a book collecting prize in addition to being a rare book dealer, working with collectors every day. And what this experience has given me, as well as collecting myself, is a pretty clear sense of my own opinions of what I feel about collecting. And so for me, first, I think that you have to have your overarching topic. So mine was Jane Austen's bookshelf. It was going to be her favorite women writers from Frances Burney and Maria Edgeworth. And I had those parameters because Austen mentions those authors specifically. And then the question is, am I going to be more specific in my parameters? Am I only going to collect literally her bookshelf, like books that were available in her time period? And I decided, because I wanted to look at things like, what happened to them after they died. Frances Burney lived longer than Austen. I can't do that if it's only something that was on Austen's shelf. So I decided to be more flexible in that. And then you get even more granular and you say, do I want copies that have interesting provenance, which is to say they had some history of ownership that was interesting, or do I want pristine copies? What am I looking for? There was one copy of Female Quixote, Charlotte Lennox's book, that I bought that was absolutely destroyed, and it needed a rebind in order to keep the text block from further deterioration. So I actually had it bound by my favorite contemporary bookbinder. And so that was another opportunity, a choice that I could make. And so you can see it kind of starts top down and gets more complicated. And it's, to me, again, an example of the process is the point. That's the joy of it. I like having the bookshelf in the end, but it is finding that book when I'm visiting the shop in London on the 4th floor where I didn't expect it. And then this one where I'm bidding at auction for it online, and I'm like clicking the big red button, hoping no one else does. And that compared to, running across something randomly in a house call and saying, oh, I would never have even recognized this until I had gone down this rabbit hole. So all of those things kind of coming together and allowing myself to be open. I think many of us have experienced that once you learn something, once you have this new avenue of knowledge or you have this epiphany, you start to see it everywhere. And that was what it felt like working on this collection. So I really was allowing myself as much as possible to be open to wherever it took me, and I tried to very faithfully chronicle that because, again, I would love if this book was seen as something of a model for how people can collect. It doesn't have to be expensive. If you like Jane Austen, Pride and Prejudice is a 6-figure book, but the Elizabeth Inchbald plays we were talking about earlier, I was buying some of those individual plays, which are great plays, by the way, at like $35 each, and 18th century first editions, I want to be clear. So it's the rare book marketplace, and rare book collecting is very different on the ground in the way that most collectors interact with it than what the idea of it is. We have our idea of our Shakespeare folios that are millions of dollars. And then when you have how people actually collect, which is they're buying what they love and they're interested in these books as historical artifacts. And that's the beginning and end of it. And price is completely based on the individual person.
Yeah, I enjoyed sort of picturing how your bookshelf must look with the 18th century raised bands and Morocco and things like that next to, like you said, the sort of cracked paperback spines. And it kind of, I guess in my brain, looks like the cover of the book, which is cool.
Yeah, these actually were supplied from, so they asked for some images from the collection, so I sent them some images, and that's what they incorporated into the book cover, which is nice. So it's the Jane Austen bookshelf, literally.
That is nice, yeah. Oh, and the green is the Frances Burney.
Yeah, so they actually changed the green of Frances Burney. It's right here, the blue. Yeah, but that's the female Quixote we were talking about. Anyway, sorry, I
yeah, we're getting a
dive down.
Well, when you're able to go buy these in the lobby, you can take a gander for yourself. You mentioned this idea of the lone genius that Jane Austen gets sort of shoehorned into, which is so obviously not true. We wouldn't be here if that were true. I was delighted to see sort of the same supporting characters popping up throughout the book. I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about the sort of literary and social constellations that these people were moving in.
Yeah, so one of the people who keeps popping up, I've already mentioned, is Samuel Johnson, Dictionary Johnson. So he's most famous for having published the English language dictionary, the Monumental Dictionary, in 1755. Before 1755, when he was a poor working writer, he was very close friends with Charlotte Lennox, the woman I was talking about earlier, who had to work for a living. They really got along because they both needed to make money, and they were both incredibly brash and opinionated, so they were buds. And in fact, when her first novel came out, he threw her a book launch party, and they stayed out all night, and he had her special made a hot apple pie with laurels crowning it in celebration of her.
It was so cute. I love to read your description of that. It made me smile.
Well, it is. They have a very specific image of Johnson as being he's grumpy and imposing and incredible intellect, and just being in the same room with him would be incredibly intimidating. And in fact, you can imagine him just bantering with Charlotte Lennox. That's a very easy thing to imagine. And then he also was involved with a number of other people in the book, and most of the time he is incredibly supportive of their literary endeavors. Not all the time, though. The flip side of having someone as famous as Johnson being your friend is it's very similar to the Jane Austen Smurfette principle, which is that his name starts to get imposed on everything that you do. So in the case of Charlotte Lennox, her most famous book is this book called The Female Quixote, which is really good. It is based on, Cervantes, think Don Quixote, but instead of, it's transposed the plot into 18th century England. There's a young woman who's retired, growing up in the countryside, not with a lot of access to society, and she's reading lots of the old romances that are similar to what Don Quixote is reading. And so when she goes into society, she doesn't realize that it's not like the romances she's been reading. And this is a very famous book, it's a very good book. Austen read it and reread it, and her novel, Northanger Abbey, is essentially updating that plot for the 1790s, for the next generation. So the influence is very clear. It was, famous for decades, very canonical then. But after both Lennox and Johnson die in the Victorian era, a random admirer of Johnson says, "Oh, I think that chapter at the very end that's super philosophical. Well, Lennox was really close with Samuel Johnson. He probably wrote that." And it was like, why though? Why? And it was like, and they would cite internal evidence, like style. And what I found was that these things were like persistent little viruses throughout, affecting someone's reputation, like someone like Charlotte Lennox, where when I was looking for these books on the marketplace, you would see this still happen. So the idea that Johnson wrote that chapter in Female Quixote has been debunked, and it's been debunked for a while now. You can read the article by Susan Carlyle, I believe, who wrote the article. And there's even like a letter that is in the Beinecke that Charlotte Lennox writes to Samuel Johnson saying, "Here, I'm sending you the last volume because you haven't seen it yet." So we have pretty clear evidence from we have that letter, plus we have a number of other factors that Carlyle goes into. And so this is like done, it is put to bed. And yet, in the rare book world, prices are based partially on demand. And there are a lot more Samuel Johnson collectors than there are Charlotte Lennox collectors. So if in your description you're writing about the Female Quixote and you can say, "Oh, well, some of this may have been written by Johnson," then you're opening up all the Johnsonians as potential buyers. And so what kept on happening is I would see a description for the Female Quixote, and they'd say, "Well, Samuel Johnson may have written the penultimate chapter." No, he did not. We're done with this. But the commercial incentives are encouraging people to act as if this is still a debate. And so that's something that you see, I think, my frustration over and over again, which is that there's this amazing work that the feminist recovery movement is doing beginning about in the 1970s, and these things have been researched. I was relying heavily on amazing biographies and other original research done by academics, and in many cases, those narratives and those facts, those stories have not made it into the mainstream. Places like rare book dealer catalogs, but also places like Wikipedia, popular, any type of sort of popular vision of these writers, it still keeps to those conservative, older views. And so we're perpetuating it even when we know better. And that was very frustrating.
Yeah, I kept a little running list of like banger quotes that I just wrote in a Google Doc and printed out. And one of those was, "Every generation must, in its turn, scrape off the barnacles of previous generations' criticism and look at the evidence for themselves." And that resonated so much. You see so much of this stuff just cited over and over and over again without actually going back to the sources. Same with the canon of, these women contributed to the rise of Jane Austen, but they are not worth looking at in their own respects. But then going back and reading them, heck yeah.
Yeah, and I did get this sense, there were critics I was reading from 1880 and from 1950 who had read, say, I really loved The Mysteries of Udolpho by Anne Radcliffe. They had read it and they didn't like it. I read it and I did. And part of the reason that I love The Mysteries of Udolpho is because it's very much about women's agency. she is imprisoned in this castle, essentially, and she has been, all her power and choice has been taken away, and that symbol, plays itself out through this Gothic landscape. So I found it very fresh and relevant, and I could see why a man from 1880 might not, And so I don't necessarily have a problem if you read these books and you don't like them, but I think that it is imperative that every generation is going to have their own response, and that's part of the reason why I kind of glory in my subjectivity in this book, and I say, I love this book, I hated this book. That's my statement. I'm not going to pretend that was objective.
That's my story, and I'm sticking to it. We've talked a lot about Jane Austen and the authors. I would like to turn now to the readers. I've so far resisted talking about the glory of the well-loved book and what that can tell us about a lot of things. But can you tell me a little bit about one of your favorite examples of readership appearing in one of your Jane Austen's bookshelf books?
Oh, I can. One of my favorite examples was, I mentioned at the beginning that there was this book called Cecilia by Frances Burney that the phrase Pride and Prejudice appears in. This was a very popular book. Austen loved it. It's likely where she got the phrase. I knew I had to have a copy of Cecilia for my Jane Austen bookshelf, but this is what a collector does. A collector is not just thinking of the text alone, you're looking at the book as a historical artifact. So you're saying not just which book do I want, but which copy of this book do I want and why. So I was waiting for the right copy, and the right copy of Cecilia was one that was actually pretty yucky. It was pretty beat up. And so Cecilia was published in 5 volumes, and the 4th and 5th volume, the the leather bindings were kind of like stained pinkish. They had pink stains on them. I was like, oh, what could that possibly be from? Well, we know, in fact, what that was from, because the first owner of the book, we know it was first owner because she signed her name Bettina Coleman from the 1780s. She puts her name in the book, and then in the last volume, she writes a little note, and it says, by accident, a strawberry fell onto this book, which has stained the leaves. And I just love, especially that she writes that in volume 5, like she has gone on that journey, and she is still there, enjoying her snack, like just wrapped, clearly, doesn't want to stop eating or stop reading in order to eat. And for me, it was such a moment of time travel, of connecting human to human across 250 years. And that's another thing that book collecting really can do, is it can allow us to feel the richness and the humanity of the past, and especially when you're talking about well-loved books that show traces of our human interaction with these books. Like, that's fundamentally what these books represent to us, is our humanity.
Yeah, I remember at the New York Fair, you showed me the strawberry book, and I had not read that chapter yet, and it was a little bit of a spoiler, but it was just so wonderful to see, and you were so excited to show me, and we are definitely yucky book kindred spirits. Marginalia, heck yeah. And speaking of evidence, in 200 years or 250 years, how do you think a historian will use evidence from your library to speculate on your life as a writer?
Well, I wrote a lot in my books. I talk about this in the book. I do have parameters for writing in my books, so I am not writing in the 1809 first edition of Maria Edgeworth books. I'm not doing that. But if a book is contemporary to me, which is to say published in my lifetime, I write very extensively in it. I also write in pencil because I'm following sort of modern best conservation practices. I just don't do anything that can't be undone. So I do have my own little rules. But following those rules, I am quite extensive about marking up my books. And I think what someone would see if they were to look back at my writing practices and my reading practices next to the book is they would say, oh, she really held back in the book, actually. Because in the margins, I'm very blunt. I'm like, no, this is wrong. Or, yes, that's awesome. And I just have a very strong, whatever emotional reaction I have in that moment that I feel I can have honestly. I do in the book, I do pretty actively criticize Some modern scholars, some of my contemporary colleague booksellers, if I feel like I disagree with them, I will say so, but I try to do it in ways where I'm showing the evidence and I'm being very measured. And in my marginalia, I am not measured. I'm like, wrong. So I would hope that in 200 years, like a scholar would at least just get a kick out of that.
Yeah, I have definitely gotten a kick out of finding a Victorian book that I was looking at once. In the margins, it was someone who was just progressively more surprised. So they would write, oh, with 2 exclamation points, oh, with 4 exclamation points. And yeah, it's just wonderful to find those stories. I think before we go to audience questions, just one more. You say that Elizabeth Bennet is the Austen heroine you would like to be, but which heroine do you think you are?
Catherine Morland. I don't even have to think about this. I have a whole spiel about Catherine Morland in the book. Northanger Abbey is my favorite Austen novel. That is a questionable choice, I know. I will defend it. Here's my basic defense. It's a book about loving books. It's a book about someone who there's so many bookish conversations in that book about how books interact with our lives and how they enrich our lives. And Catherine Morland, what I love about her is that, she is inexperienced. She's young, she's a teenager, and she is, as with Female Quixote, she's kind of coming out into society for the first time, and she makes mistakes. But when she makes mistakes, she goes, oh, well, that makes sense. Okay, well, I'm going to change my behavior accordingly. And then there are these occasions where she's kind of made fun of for her innocence, but I feel like she is just earnestly moving through the space. And I felt like showing a heroine like that, who is legitimately making stupid decisions, and also legitimately is also trying to be a good person, that's a very hard balance. And I feel like it's very human, that we are making mistakes and we are doing stupid things, even while we are trying earnestly to just move through space in a way that's responsible.
Yes, a very admirable trait to have, correcting one's mistakes and learning from them. Well, thank you for chatting with me. Now we will move to audience questions. There will be folks roving around with microphones, so if you could raise your hand and wait until the microphone gets to you before you ask your question. Got one down in front.
Hi.
Oh, you're next.
Oh,
You're good to go back there.
okay. Thank you. Great talk and wonderful topic, and thank you. I'm wondering, how easy is it to get hold of these books today? I'm assuming there are no ebooks available, but tell us how.
I'm so happy you're asking this question, because it is actually very easy. I read these books in all sorts of different ways. In some cases, I would be reading about the book, and I would stop, and I would open my laptop, and I would just pull up a digital copy and start reading it right there. So a lot of them are available as ebooks. They've been digitized in various forms. Gutenberg.org is your friend. I used Google Books too. I used there are a number of libraries that have these, HathiTrust, for example. So there are many ways that you can see digitized copies. The thing that's great about the world that we live in right now in terms of the internet and how it plays with rare books and book collecting is that you don't have to live in a place like New York in order to have access to great antiquarian bookshops or secondhand bookshops. It's been this terrible thing where we've lost a lot of in-person secondhand bookshops. But if you want to read a copy of the Female Quixote and you want a paperback copy or a physical copy, you don't want to read it online, you can find a copy for $5. That was the Oxford World's Classics copy from 1984. Very easily, and get it delivered, and there you go. And you're supporting a used bookstore as well. So, in fact, access is not the problem anymore. That's something I talk about quite a bit. Earlier scholars didn't necessarily have access, or if you're an early fan, you're reading Austen's letters, and you see that she's talking about the Female Quixote, and you say, oh, I would like to read that. You couldn't necessarily walk into a used bookshop and find a copy. You'd have to hope it was there, but the first copy of Female Quixote published in the 20th century wasn't until 1970. So if you were in 1940, you were out of luck. So now we live in a golden age of access. And that's one of the reasons why rabbit holes like this are possible, is because there's so much that institutions have made accessible online. And then we have a very vibrant book-selling community of used books as well.
Okay, now the person in front.
Like Allie, I enjoyed the parts of the book that were about being a rare bookseller as much as the stories of all these authors. So when you bought this whole shelf of green-bound books, whom did you think you were going to sell them to, and who did buy them?
So the reason she asked the question of the early books, like when I bought them, who did I think I was going to sell them to, who did I sell them to? That's very squarely in my business. I've sold many copies from that series. It's called the Cranford series, based on Elizabeth Gaskell's book, The Cranford, because that was the first in the series. Those are like the antiquarian bookseller equivalent of a bestseller. They will always sell. And so I didn't even need to look at the text, I just knew. And those can sell both to institutional collections and to private collectors. And my business as a rare book dealer is about 50-50 institutions and private collectors. So I think in those cases, I mean, those are long gone, but I probably sold them to a mixture of both.
I think PBS did a series on the Cranford books.
Yeah, the Cranford books are gorgeous, and if you're looking for a gateway drug of book collecting, can I recommend?
Another question.
I can't wait to get home and read this, but the whole influence of Burney on Pride and Prejudice, and Radcliffe on Northanger Abbey, do you feel that as Jane progressed to the Emma and Persuasion, it was still as influenced by some of these authors, or more kind of her own voice?
So it's not an or, it's an and, right? So absolutely. Persuasion, I think, was heavily influenced by one of her earliest influences, which was Charlotte Smith, a novelist that she loved as a teenager. And you see, Persuasion is a very mature work, but I think I make an argument in the book about why Charlotte Smith probably influenced it. And I do think that it is a mistake to consider influence as anything as exclusive to maturity as an artist. I think most artists, all artists, we are not in a vacuum, right? We are responding to the influences around us and having a dialogue and borrowing things and making them your own. One of the discoveries that I had in the process of working on this, which sounds like a bad thing but was a wonderful thing, is I realized that Austen was not as original as I thought. And again, it sounds bad, but for me what it was is it became so much more interesting because I saw what her version of this trope was, because now I understood that it was a trope. Right? She decided with the same scene to go this way with it. And so it actually helped me appreciate Austen more because I saw what she was doing with her influences.
Yeah, even the phrase Pride and Prejudice, as you mentioned in the book, like spoilers, it pops up not just in Burney, but in several other places. And it's like, oh, which came first, chicken or the egg? And it sort of tickles this sort of linguistic curiosity, too. Question down here?
Did you visit any libraries or archives or special collections to commune with any of the papers of these lady writers?
I did a few. I will say that this was largely a COVID project. You know, I started writing I started reading some of the books in 2019, but I didn't start really writing it until 2020 and 2021. So a lot of the era that I was doing my research, it was remote. But no, I visited Chawton House. I visited the Chawton House Library, and because I have institutional customers, I do visit the institutions, and when I'm there, I will often ask to see things. Sort of take advantage of my privileges. So I did do that, absolutely. But partially, because my expertise is based in book collecting, and because that's what I wanted to showcase, and showcase how you can do that outside of an institutional setting, I wanted to make sure that the emphasis was on something that anyone could do at home, rather than, you know, having to set up appointments at the Beinecke, for example. So yes, absolutely. And also my core was trying to be much more just a private collector in scope and perspective.
One back there.
Hi, this was wonderful. I'm just wondering when you first became interested in Jane Austen, and what was it about her work that captured you at first?
I started reading Austen as a teenager. I didn't read all of her novels, I think, until I'd gotten into my 20s, but I had read Pride and Prejudice and Emma when I was a teenager. And for me, there were two things that I was attracted to in Austen. First was I thought she was very witty. I thought she was sort of elegantly witty, like you're just kind of, you imagine being at a dinner party and just sharing a glance with her across the table that says it all. Like that's what it feels like reading Austen, and I was really attracted to that. And the other thing that I loved about her that was a trait that was really a North Star for this book is that I feel that she is a very confident writer. She has a discipline of style that I think is only possible when you have a true sense of confidence and belief in oneself. And that was something I really wanted to channel as I was working on this book, because I was, as Allie mentioned in that quote, kind of trying to scrape off all the barnacles of what everyone else was saying and read these books myself and say, how do I feel about this? And Austen was a great model for me for that. So that was something that existed beforehand that ended up playing kind of this incidental, inspirational role.
Got another couple back there.
Hello. Hello. I guess my question is kind of about gender. I'm looking around the room. I love a female-dominated space. But I mean, in Jane Austen's time, she was read and well-respected by both genders. I mean, Prince Regent wanted Emma dedicated to him. So what's going on? Why over time have all these other authors, female authors, been forgotten? Why is this room full of women? How do we kind of change our perspective? Sorry, I have a cold. How do we kind of change our perspective on women's place in the time Jane Austen was writing these other authors, and also people's perspectives today about these authors?
I am going to try very hard not to give a improv dissertation. But I will say that this has actually been studied by scholars, the fact that the novel was considered a feminine form, and in the Victorian era that changes and it becomes a masculine form, and that begins with Walter Scott and then continues on with Dickens, and it was masculinized. There was a very gendered component, and I talk a little bit about that turning point in the book because let's go to Frances Burney. So Frances Burney is publishing in this incredible amount of time. So 1770s is when her first book comes out, and then her last novel, 1814, The Wanderer. In 1814, this is actually right when Austen's publishing. I think Mansfield Park comes out in 1814. And it came out to an incredible amount of fanfare. It had a large print run, something like 3,000 copies that sold out immediately, like that day. Austen never got anywhere near this type of popularity. And one of the famous critics of the time, William Hazlitt, wrote what is now considered an infamous takedown of Burney on the occasion of this novel, because he called her a mere common observer of manners and a very woman. And this is a critical turning point when you think about what canonical means to us. Usually when we say, why is something canonical, we say, because it's universal. That's the word we use, universal. And if you say, Burney's not universal, she's niche. She's not writing to everyone. She's writing only for women, not for men. Then you are moving her from universal and canonical into niche, right? So that's sort of this sleight of hand that happens critically. And you see that continue to happen through the 19th century. And then Austen gets to be built up on the Smurfette principle. We're going to let one represent them all, right? And then that kind of continues in the 20th century with the rise of genre fiction, and specifically you have genre fiction not only with science fiction and mystery, but also the romance novel. And the romance novel is a very highly feminized space. And as a highly feminized space, it gets very easily denigrated. And those things tend to go together. And so part of what I do to explore in the book is ask myself, like, why did I have this bias? Why had I not read any of these women? In this time period, scholars gave this a name, the fact that for so long we just skipped over these women. They call it the Great Forgetting. So as I say, these paths have been tread by scholars, by people who are doing the work. And the question is, how do we move it into the mainstream? And that was a lot of what I was hoping to do with the book. And, you know, for me, I kind of feel like Mysteries of Udolpho TV series when? That's what I want.
Seconded.
And, you know, having conversations like this are just attempting to move that needle and to say, you know, this is universal, and part of universality is in the particular. That's something actually that we established with modernism. So we can live with that now, and we should live with that now. And I think that Austen is an interesting bellwether for that, because a lot of men read Austen, and a lot of Austen editions come out with very feminized covers. And I remember having a conversation in college with like a guy I was dating, you know, and I was reading, you know, Emma or something, and it had a very feminine cover, and he was, I don't know, reading like Kerouac, right, something. And he looked at me and he said, I wish I could get away with reading that. And I was like, that's on you. You know, but you can see how there's all of this cultural pressure, right, based on how that book cover was telling him he wasn't the audience, right? So there are a number of things happening here. It's not a simple answer, but part of the reason that I say I wrote a book was because this is not an article, right? This is the glib answer to all of this question of why did it happen this way? Why do we only remember Austen? The glib short answer is, well, sexism, obviously. But the answer, in fact, is much more complicated than that, and complicated in really interesting ways that touch on all these other themes. So it benefits us to complicate it. This was not an article-length thing. This was a book-length exploration. It needed to be that length. I couldn't just, you know, tweet about it or whatever.
And we have time for one more question. Down here.
I rise not to praise my sex, but to bury it. I love Jane Austen, partly because she's a brilliant read, but also because I like smart, witty women, and reading Jane Austen helps me understand and appreciate them. My wife, who adores Jane Austen, has learned to like the John Sandford mystery novels because it helps her understand men. So I don't know how to encourage my fellow men to read more Austen, but maybe if we get some really muscular covers, that will help.
I would love that. Oh, can you imagine a masculine-coded Jane Austen reprint series? Oh.
Mr. Darcy in like a white tank top.
Yeah.
All right. Well, thank you for all of your fantastic questions. Thank you, Rebecca. Thank you to the Free Library for hosting this event.